Welcome to Crossroads. Glad you're here worshiping with us today. My name is Steve Corder, lead pastor here, and if this is your first time with us, welcome. We're delighted that you're with us today. Now, we're looking over these last few weeks at how to get off life's crazy train. Sometimes life just gets crazy. We get filled with stress and anxiety and chaos is all around us. However, there are other moments that there are certain people who bring to us stress and chaos and anxiety. Just interacting with them, we call these people CrazyMakers. Yes, life can get crazy, but sometimes there are people in our lives that act as CrazyMakers, and when we interact with them, we get feeling insecure and confused, perhaps even guilty sometimes. So today we're going to take a look at CrazyMakers and how we can interact with them in a healthy way. So Rick Warren, he listed several types of CrazyMakers. I want to share those with you. And as I do, consider this the holiday edition of the CrazyMaker edition. Because, the holidays are coming up and you might be interacting with some of these folks. But as I go through the list, please no elbowing the person next to you at any point along the list. Let's just kind of take these in, all right? So Rick Warren's, he's a preacher. He had them all start with the letter D. His first is the demanding CrazyMaker. This person's pushy, they're bossy, they're controlling. They dominate every conversation. They make unrealistic demands. They tell us what we're supposed to do, when we're supposed to do it. They look for us to jump when they speak. These are demanding CrazyMakers. Now, there's another kind of CrazyMaker, and that is the disapproving CrazyMaker. These folks are highly picky. They're very critical. They're negative. They're judgmental perfectionists. And as you're talking with them, they'll just routinely toss in these little digs. Almost you don't always notice it, but the accumulated impact is there. And they love to point out our mistakes. When you walk away, you just get the sense, I'm just not good enough. That's a disapproving kind of CrazyMaker. And then there's the destructive CrazyMaker. This person has unresolved anger issues. These are the volcanoes that we interact with. These folks erupt from time to time. They just spew their anger and even rage at times. And so we don't want to set them off. We end up walking on eggshells when we're around them because we just don't know exactly what's going to trip them up. Then there's the fourth kind of CrazyMaker, the discontented CrazyMaker. And these are folks who have their feelings hurt very, very easily. They whine a lot as well. They're kind of touchy, they're thin-skinned. They invent ways to be offended. I mean, you didn't even know you offended them, but they still get offended anyway. They're chronic complainers. They get attention by displaying the wounds that have been inflicted upon them so that people come around and say, oh, you're such a poor thing. And so these are discontented CrazyMakers. And then there's the demeaning CrazyMakers. These folks are the smart mouths. They're rude. They are insulting. They make cutting remarks. And now that we've got social media, they do that all the time, 24/7 online. They like burst bubbles. You think you have a good idea, they'll tell you why it's not. And they're very rude. The very rude people are often that way because they're deeply insecure. So they cut down other people so that they themselves don't feel bad in comparison. And I like to add a number 6 CrazyMaker, and that is the drama king or the drama queen. And these are folks who always have a crisis going on. And as a matter of fact, they will export that crisis into your life. If things are too peaceful, they will figure out a way to create some drama just because that's what they're used to. So we got a lot of different kind of CrazyMakers. Maybe you might work with some of these people. You might be related to some of these people. And the reality is, if we interact with them regularly, it can drive us crazy. How is it we can stay sane while we interact with CrazyMakers, especially around the holiday time? Well, we've got some good news. There's a way to do it. It's this: boundaries keep difficult people from driving us crazy. Boundaries do that. Now, we're all familiar with property boundaries, right? I mean, we have fences. You see that on this side of the fence, that's my property. On that side of the fence, that's your property. And as long as the fence is respected, things are fine. There's an old saying, good fences make good neighbors. What does that mean? It means that when we're all clear on whose property it is, this is your responsibility, this is my responsibility, things go smoothly. But when that's not clear, when the boundaries start to get squishy, then things get a little bit problematic. A friend of mine came home from work recently, and he saw that his neighbor had taken a backhoe and driven his backhoe into my friend's yard and had ripped out some of his shrubbery and his hedges. Now, if you take your backhoe and you rip out your own shrubbery on your property, that's not a problem. More power to you, that's great. But if you go over the boundary line and you go into the other person's yard and you start doing their landscaping, now that can be kind of touchy. That can be a problem. Boundaries are really important to not be driven crazy. Now, Cloud and Townsend are two Christian psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors. And they wrote a book, it's kind of a classic book, called Boundaries. And they say this: just as homeowners set physical property lines around their land, we need to set mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual boundaries for our lives to help us distinguish what is our responsibility and what isn't. You see, life gets crazy when we don't know what's our responsibility and what's somebody else's responsibility. Cloud gives an example of a couple who came to him for counseling. They were greatly troubled by their son. You might say that their son was driving them crazy. The son's about 25 years old at that point. And his life was nothing like what the parents wanted it to be. You see, this 25-year-old had flunked out of several colleges, and he had tried different jobs, but nothing stuck. He had no career. He just kind of hung around the house and hung out with other people who were in a similar situation. And the parents said, he doesn't think he has a problem, but it's pretty clear he does. He's not doing anything. In fact, he's addicted to drugs now, they said. We don't know what to do. And so Cloud invited him to speak a little bit more about what happened. And the parents said, we love him very much. In fact, we've tried to just meet every one of his needs. When he went to college, we made sure we paid for everything because we didn't want to have him working. We wanted him to focus full-time on study and the social life, and that we didn't want to bother him with having to work at all. And when he would flunk out or stop going to class, the parents would swoop in and they would say, all right, we're going to get you into another college. It'll be a better fit for you this time. And they'd do that, and then he'd quit going to class then too, and they'd have to try for college number 3. And as he came back home and wasn't working, he had plenty of time to hang out with other friends and ended up addicted to drugs, and nothing they said seemed to make a difference in his life that way. And Dr. Cloud listened, and after a while he said, okay, I think your son is right. He doesn't have a problem. And the father said, what? He was stunned. Dr. Cloud said, yeah, your son doesn't have a problem. You do. He said, your son's got it made. Whatever he does, he just hangs out, and you pay for him. You worry, you fret, you try to plan, you try to exert effort. He just hangs out, and everything need is met, and he has no problems. You're taking all of his problems for him, Dr. Cloud said. His decisions should come with consequences that he deals with, but you're dealing with them all. You have all his problems. He has none left. What you need to do is draw some boundaries, he said. You should allow him to experience his own consequences. You need to know what your responsibility is and what his responsibility is. When we don't know that, when we don't draw boundaries in the right place, and life gets crazy. And you know what? Jesus had to deal with crazy makers too. His crazy makers were called Pharisees. Now, Pharisees have a reputation among Christians today as being hard-hearted, mean-spirited kind of guys. But in their day, they were the good guys. They were known as the ones who loved God the most. because they were very focused on paying attention to God's law. They were different than the Sadducees. Now, in the New Testament, you'll sometimes see them both referred to, Pharisees, Sadducees. Neither one were big fans of Jesus, but for different reasons. The Sadducees were the priests. They were the aristocrats of the time. They were the rulers and the leaders. Whereas the Sadducees, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in a final judgment. The Pharisees believed in all those things, as did Jesus. And the Pharisees believed a lot more like Jesus did than the Sadducees did. The Pharisees were the common guys. They were focused, as I said, on keeping the law as a way to honor God. And they were not a fan of Jesus because they were not convinced that he had the same goals, that he wanted to keep the law like they did. So, they were opposed to him. And in Matthew 22, if you got your Bible, you can turn with me there, or on your app, you can turn there. We'll have it on the screen as well. We're going to see an interaction that Jesus has with Pharisees, these crazy makers in his life. And it says in verse 15, "Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with Herodians. 'Teachers,' they said, 'we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what's your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?' But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, 'You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax.' They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, 'Whose image is this, and whose inscription?' 'Caesar's,' they replied. Then he said to them, 'So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.' When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away." Jesus here drew boundaries. The Pharisees came after him in a nice-sounding way, but Jesus deflected them by drawing boundaries. You see, the Pharisees thought they had a brilliant way to silence Jesus, which was their goal. They were going to ask him a question. Now, it sounds like an innocent question to you or me. Is it right to pay the tax to Caesar? But here's what was going on. At that time, Israel was in occupied territory. The Romans had conquered Israel, and they were a military occupation in the land. All the Jews hated this idea. Here were these pagans who were occupying God's land, the land that God promised to Abraham, to his generations upon generations. And here these pagans were ruling God's land and God's people, and every Jew hated that idea. So they knew, the Jews did, that the taxes they paid supported that military machine. And so it became a kind of point of faith for some to say, I'm not going to pay the tax, because if I pay taxes, it's just paying for the Romans to occupy us. And so many religious people fought against this. Well, the Pharisees thought, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask Jesus, should you pay the tax or not? If he says yes, because it's the law, then all these other Jews will stop listening to him because they'll say, oh, he's supporting those pagans, we can't listen to him. And if he says no, then some of those people might be happy at Jesus, but he won't be around long because the Romans will say, oh, here's a rebel, and we're going to crush him and take him out. So they'd ask this question that sounds innocent. Should we pay the temple tax or should we not pay the temple tax? And as a matter of fact, they do it in such a nice way. They say, oh, teacher, we know you have integrity, you're from God. And they phrase it this way, so that if anybody would come to them and say, you're trying to take Jesus down, they say, what? We're just asking the master for his guidance. We're just asking a spiritual question to let us know what we should be doing. They kind of sound really nice while they're stabbing him in the back at the same time. This is classic crazy maker behavior right here. So how does Jesus deal with it? Well, he's having none of it. First, he goes right to the point. He gets honest. He says, look, you're trying to trap me. He knows what's happening, and he names it. And then he draws boundaries. Whose picture's on the coin? Caesar. All right, that's his. Give it to him. Whatever's Caesar's, give it to him. Whatever's to God, give it to God. In other words, don't confuse your loyalty to the government with your loyalty to God. They're not the same thing. So he's clear on responsibilities. He's drawing a boundary. And they went away. It says, all right, we didn't trap him after all because he drew boundaries. When Jesus was interacting with the Pharisees, he was interacting with a couple of the different categories or types of CrazyMaker right here. First, the Pharisees were acting like disapproving CrazyMakers. And there's nothing quite like a disapproving religious CrazyMaker, right? Verse 15, they come, they're trying to trap him. That's right off the bat. We're going to come and trap him. And so they start with antagonism to Jesus. They're against him. They think he's a heretic. They don't think he's from God. And so they're just trying to take him out. They're trying to justify it. They don't like Jesus. Do you deal with people who just don't seem to like you? Do you work with anybody who just doesn't like you? Maybe you live on a street with somebody who just doesn't seem to like you. Well, notice how Jesus deals with the fact that the Pharisees just don't like him. He doesn't fret about this. He doesn't say, how can I make them like me? I mean, how can they be against me? I'm such a nice guy. I heal people and feed food and multiply the loaves for the hungry. And maybe if I just hang out with them longer, if I answer some of their questions, maybe we can do things together and they'll like me. Jesus didn't do that. No, he knew who he was. He knew that he was beloved by the Father, and he just stayed on his mission. We need to face the fact sometimes people just won't like us. I mean, if we have a conflict, we can understand we need to work it out and such, but sometimes there's just no conflict. They just don't like us for whatever reason. We don't know why. And we may never know why. And maybe because you remind them of somebody who bullied them in middle school, right? And they just say, oh, I don't like that person. Or maybe your voice just sounds like somebody that, used to criticize them a lot. Who knows? They don't know. They might not even know why they don't like you. And they might just have decided ahead of time they don't like you. That's what prejudice is. And prejudice has no rationale. So, there's no real reason. Why don't they like me? Friends, we can't let that drive us crazy. When we're dealing with a disapproving CrazyMaker, we need to draw a boundary around our self-worth. Draw a boundary around our self-worth. Guard our self-worth, because our self-image cannot be given into the hands of somebody else. We can't draw it from our interactions with other people. We are valuable to God because he's created us. He loves us. That's why we're worthy. You see, the one who knows you best, God, loves you most. Let that be an encouragement to you. The one who knows you best loves you most. The one who created you loves you and will for all time. That's why you know you're worthwhile. So we draw a boundary. We put a wall around our self-image, around our self-esteem, not for everybody. We don't want to keep everybody out of our life, by no means. We're just not going to give people who don't like us access to our heart and to our self-worth. Jesus knew who he was. When he started his ministry, he heard a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in him I'm well pleased." I hope you hear that too. The scriptures tell us, Jesus demonstrates that if you put your faith in Jesus, you are a child of your heavenly Father. You are his beloved son or daughter. That's who you are. Don't let anybody else tell you other than that. And so we put a wall around our self-image by focusing on God's impression of us, and we don't seek approval from those who are not going to give it. Some of us need to hear this right now as we're coming into the holiday season. You need to stop trying to get approval from people who are not going to give it to you. That's what it means to put a boundary around your self-worth and your self-image. Recognize they're not the ones that make me worthy. God is. And I'm not going to allow them to take my self-image from me. If anybody ever tells you, when you're distressed because somebody's, on your case, if somebody says, don't let them get to you, what they're saying is, you're letting their opinion of you determine your opinion of you. Don't do that. Create a boundary around your self-worth when you're dealing with disapproving types. Now, the Pharisees also were interacting with Jesus as demanding crazy-makers do. They were demanding that Jesus follow their agenda. So here in verses 16 and 17, again, now you know the background of this whole question. You can see what they're doing here as they falsely try to flatter him before they stick him in the back with a knife. They send their disciples along with Herodians saying, "Teacher, we know that you're a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what's your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax?" Jesus did not come to settle tax questions. He came to bring the kingdom of God through his life, his teaching, his death, and resurrection. And he was not going to let anybody pull him off into any kind of other agenda. He did not come to be a political leader, even though some people wanted him to be that. In fact, his own supporters wanted to make him king at one point. He said, no way. He knew what he was about. He had a boundary around that. And you and I need that too when we confront people who are trying to tell us what to do in a demanding way, in an unhealthy way. When we're dealing with the demanding crazy maker, draw a boundary around your responsibilities. Around your responsibilities. Now, here's a picture of a boundary around responsibilities. Your lack of planning is not my emergency. That's known as a boundary right there. All right, this is your responsibility. This is my responsibility. We need to be clear on that. Otherwise, it drives us crazy. Sometimes parents experience this. Like when their middle schooler comes at 9 o'clock at night and says, I've got a science project due tomorrow. I need to make a model of the solar system. Could you go to the store and get some stuff for me? And, that's a moment for drawing boundaries for parents to say, okay, look, I love you. Here's what you need to know. Your responsibility is to take care of your homework in a timely way, and mine is to help you be successful. So it will not be helping you be successful in life if I run out now. You need to understand how to plan this so that you'll be better off in your life. You'll thank me later, So the drawing of lines for boundaries around responsibilities is not always clear, but if we don't get it in a reasonably right way, it's going to drive us crazy. So, if you're working for somebody and the boss comes to you and says, I need you to do this thing, you don't really have the right at that point to draw a line around that responsibility and say, boss, that request does not really meet my agenda or needs right now. No, if you're drawing a paycheck from that, that company, you got to do what's your responsibility is to fulfill the boss's role. But now, if the boss expects you to be available 24/7 with never a vacation, never a break, then you have to decide, am I going to allow that? Am I going to, draw the paycheck, but am I going to give my every waking hour to this? That's a decision you need to make. That's drawing a boundary line. Where am I going to draw it? Often, we blame other people for our stress because we have not drawn the boundary line when it comes to responsibilities. We are, as followers of Jesus, to be servants. We can't live our life for ourselves. That's selfish. It'll be a dead end. But if we consider every need in the world to be a call from God, if I put no boundaries, like everything that I'm asked to do, every kind of need that I see, it's up to me to fulfill it, there will be nothing left of us in short order. On the reverse, if I just say, unless it touches me, I'm not going to do anything, that's a dead end. That's not honoring to Jesus either. Knowing where we draw the lines for responsibilities is important, but here's the great thing. If we ask, God will help us. He'll give us some guidance. Now, you might wonder, is all of this talk about boundaries really Christ-honoring? Is this really something that is of spiritual importance to me? After all, if you look at run a search in the New Testament, it doesn't have any words, it doesn't say boundary in there. But what you do see is Jesus living with them, though. You understand, he did live with boundaries. He didn't say yes to every request. He didn't do what everybody asked him to do. He did sometimes he didn't. He drew boundaries in his life, and he did live a sacrificial life, calls us to live a sacrificial life, but hey, a sacrifice is something I choose to give, not something that is demanded or taken from me. You see, Jesus, his life, if we're going to honor him and with our lives and be like him, we need to draw boundaries because that helps us to live a more Christ-like way. Let me show you what I mean. When we draw boundary lines, first we can choose to not be offended. If I have no boundaries, I'm going to be offended because my self-image and self-esteem is damaged by this person. People are calling me around all different places, and that's going to actually take from my life. But now I can choose not to be offended if I know that my self-image is not in somebody else's hands. Matthew 5:39 says, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." To turn the other cheek is not to become a doormat. To turn the other cheek is to choose not to be offended and to be able to act by my own will and not because I'm reacting to somebody's offending me. I can decide what to do, but it's because I've drawn a boundary. My mission, my self-image doesn't come from that other person. Also, when I draw boundaries, I can forgive without being asked. Again, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:44, Jesus says, "I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Love your enemies. Now, who's an enemy? An enemy is not somebody that I don't like. An enemy is somebody who doesn't like me. And I can love my enemy if I don't depend on them for my self-image, if they don't control my life and my schedule. If I've drawn a boundary, then I can choose actually to forgive them when they've hurt me. You see, if I wait for somebody to come to me and say, "Oh, I see what I did now was so wrong, will you please forgive me?" I'll probably be waiting a long time, maybe forever. And in that wait, I'm going to be chewed up inside with resentment, bitterness taking hold. It's not the way Jesus calls us to live. So we're to forgive other people. I can do that if I've drawn the correct boundaries in my life. So CrazyMakers, yeah, they have a way of driving us nuts sometimes. And we need to know that drawing boundaries is a real important part of us learning how to live in a sane way when we're surrounded by CrazyMakers. At the same time, if we're honest, we have to admit that sometimes we're the CrazyMakers. Not all the time, but sometimes we act in ways that are out of our brokenness, not instead of out of our health. And we need to be healed, and we need to be forgiven. And that's why we go to Jesus. And we're going to do that right now as a church. We're going to have communion together. And every time we have communion, we start with a time of confession. And we say, "Lord, please forgive me." And the great news about that is every time we ask, God forgives. There's a promise in the Bible, 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's a promise. So we know when we ask for God's forgiveness, he grants it. He will heal us. He will strengthen us. That's why we do it at communion, because we want to come to the Lord's presence in communion with nothing standing between us and the Lord. We ask for forgiveness. And so in just a moment, we're going to do that. In just a moment, we're going to ask for forgiveness in a time of silent prayer, and I'm going to invite you to do that on your knees with me, if you're willing and able, to be on your knees and ask for God's forgiveness, because our body helps us to pray sometimes by our body position. After we spend some time on our knees silently before the Lord in confession, the worship team is going to lead in a song called Kyrie eleison, which means, "Lord, have mercy." That prayer goes back 1,000 years, and we're going to sing that knowing that God does have mercy. And then we'll share communion together. So, knowing that we're all broken people who live amongst broken people. We need God's forgiveness and healing. So let's seek that now. I invite you to join me in asking for God's forgiveness as we seek him on our knees.